Joining us now to continue the discussion is political analyst and historian Rich Rubino. Rich, always good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me on again.
Of course. Let's get down to the basics. I want to talk about these different approaches and the concerns that the Trump administration has versus California Governor Gavin Newsom. Break it down for the viewers. Where do these two administrations stand on this issue of immigration and ICE operations?
Well, Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom have had a rivalry for quite some time. They have had a few meetings involving other things in the past administration. Donald Trump has said in the past, probably to the chagrin of Gavin Newsom, that they actually had a pretty good relationship when Donald Trump was president. But this is a typical partisan issue where Gavin Newsom, who's governor of the state of California, in a state that is heavily Democrat. It hasn't gone Republican since George H.W. Bush won the state back in 1988. It hasn't been competitive since 2000 when Karl Rove, working for George W. Bush, put money into California and ended up losing it miserably. But this is something that probably benefits both candidates with their base. Gavin Newsom, even though he can't run for re-election in 2026, this certainly helps him with his base. Certainly, many parts of the immigrant community, and certainly with Donald Trump, it helps him with his base as well, and his populist base, for example, in terms of trying to go after a Democratic governor and it's certainly a Democratic state.
Talking a little bit about these bases, so immigration was a big campaign promise and an angle that President Trump ran on in 2024. In fact, that angle is credited a lot as to why he was elected again. When we take a look at the landscape right now and how things have played out throughout the last several months, where do lawmakers on both sides of the aisle continue to stand? And are we hearing anything from voters on the issue?
It's a very much a partisan issue. Republicans tend to support a more tough foreign policy, a more tough immigration policy. Democrats less so, I think. So it's very much a partisan issue. Although that being said, some Democrats, Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania being one, have suggested that Democrats need to take a tougher view in terms of immigration, in terms of the border. And it suggests that was one of the reasons why Democrats did not pick up the White House and did not pick up the House of Representatives in 2024. So he's suggesting that, and some other Democrats seem to be following that line a little bit. They're saying that, for example, the language is obviously very important here. Republicans would tend to use the term illegal immigration. Democrats tend to use the term undocumented immigrant. So obviously it's a little bit different terminology, but some Democrats are suggesting that perhaps they should take a tougher view, if you will, on foreign policy, and that will benefit them politically in 2026, immigration policy rather. It's very similar, I think, to the issue of transgenderism, where I think some Democrats have now suggested that perhaps the Democrats have moved too far left on that issue.
So you mentioned it a couple of times here that immigration really is this partisan issue, but also talking about how some Democrats are thinking that they need to take a stronger approach with that to try to get back to those voters. Speaking on Republicans, are there any Republican lawmakers that think they should be a little more moderate when it comes to immigration, or is it still just a black and white issue there?
You know, it's become more and more polarized, more and more black and white, from the most liberal members, from somebody like Mike Lawler of New York, to the more conservative members like Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee. They tend to be almost a monolith in terms of talking about immigration, in terms of the rhetoric that they employ on immigration, and certainly though, I think there will probably be a little bit of a groundswell of support with some moderate Republicans, maybe someone like Governor Phil Scott of Vermont, who will say that the ICE raids have essentially gone too far. But right now it's very much monolithic, and the Democrats think the 13 Democrats who in the House of Representatives, who currently represent districts that went for Donald Trump last time, might have a little bit of electoral and political latitude to move a little bit further to the right on the issue. I will say, though, that, and again, talking about the myth of the monolith, Donald Trump did better than expected with Latino voters last time around. There are some congressional districts, some parts of South Texas, for example, where there was literally a turn of about 20 points from Joe Biden to Donald Trump. So Democrats do have a problem that Latino voters are no longer as monolithically Democrat as I think the Democrats would want or need them to be in order to keep some of those congressmen in South Texas, like Henry Cuellar, for example, and I think that is why they see places like Texas in a presidential race as really electorally out of reach.
I want to talk about this separation of powers and really
Yep.
how they compare when it comes to the president, federal authority, Governor Gavin Newsom, and state authority. I want to put up, I'm pretty sure we still have this post here, in which the California governor says the Secretary of Defense now threatening to deploy active duty Marines on American soil against its own citizens. This is deranged behavior. So it's no secret that the California governor does not agree with this approach that the Trump administration is taking. But talk to me about how this power structure works here, how much the president can do to kind of move his own way when it comes to the situation, and what the governor can do to perhaps put a halt to it.
Yeah, the president does have power under the Insurrection Act of 1807 to deploy the National Guard. At least that's how so far it has been used. And we have seen precedent in this before. Back in 1957, for example, Orville Faubus, who was a Democratic governor of Arkansas and kind of a pseudo segregationist, would not allow African American students into Little Rock Central High School. He was the governor at the time, despite the fact that the Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 had said that separate but equal was inherently unequal, and said that essentially there had to be integration in the schools. So the Republican president, the moderate Republican president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, federalized the troops to bring the troops in and to allow the African American children into the school. They were called the Little Rock Nine. And in 1997, actually, President Bill Clinton, and then Governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, Democrat and Republican respectively, held the doors open as those Little Rock Nine went back into the Little Rock school. So I think historically, Dwight Eisenhower is seen as being right in terms of doing that, and Orville Faubus is seen as being wrong. The other example was in 1962. Ross Barnett was the governor of Mississippi at the time, and Ole Miss would not allow James Meredith, a young African American student, into the building to be a student. So John F. Kennedy at the time federalized the troops and allowed them to allowed him to essentially be a student and going into the school. There are other examples. For example, in 1992, during, if you remember, the Los Angeles riots, George H.W. Bush federalized the National Guard to try to restore order to the city. So there are certain examples in the past where presidents have done this, but it's obviously very few and far between, and it's a very rare instance.
So this is a live look here that we are taking. As we can see, National Guard troops, that's down there in Los Angeles right now. Always viewer discretion advised, because we're trying to showcase these live images, but of course, some of them, they can be a bit upsetting. But continuing here, Rich, and then we were just discussing this kind of separation of powers, the power the Trump administration has versus the state government. Now, several lawmakers also agreeing with California Governor Gavin Newsom that they are not liking this approach to what's happening with the protests. What can they do in this situation? We're talking Congress members and senators.
Well, all they really have is they have, I guess, like the president, although they don't have as much power in terms of using the bully pulpit. And you certainly see that. You see some members of Congress who are opposed to Donald Trump, many of them coming from predominantly Democratic congressional districts, some of them coming from districts that have a very large migrant population, if you will. They can certainly use that power, but in terms of there actually is necessarily, or president have used the federal government, have used national troops, and they have used the National Guard. Although Donald Trump is not directly using the Insurrection Act, I think what they can do electorally is they can make this a flagship issue for candidates in their district, for citizens in the district, citizens in their states rather, to elect more members of Congress who have a view more favorable toward the migrants than or more favorable to the protests rather as well. against Donald Trump. So that's really what they can do, but it's really kind of electoral thing. Donald Trump really probably has more electoral cards in his deck right now, more arrows in his quiver, if you will. But on the immigration issue, in terms of what he can do and what presidential power can do. But obviously, if there's an uprising on the streets, that's something that potentially could bring it so that the Democrats on the United States House of Representatives. And even though it's a very long haul with the currently only one member, Susan Collins, from a Harris state that's up for reelection, theoretically they could take back the United States Senate as well. And then by 2028, if they elected a president who was more to their liking, then that would be something that also would be more palatable to them, I think.
Well, Rich, we always appreciate your analysis, given this topic, especially when it comes to the political side of things. Of course, that's what runs all of these operations here. Is there anything you feel that you would like to add before I let you go? Something we may have missed, or something
Yeah.
you have your eye on?
I would just reinforce what I said earlier, that this was a huge issue back in 1957. Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president, federalized the Guard against Orville Faubus, who was kind of a states' rights Democrat. It's very interesting, again, politically here, because you're seeing Donald Trump using the power of the federal government as a Republican. The Republicans, at least contemporaneously, are known as a party that favors more devolution of powers to states. This is something where you have a Republican president rather, using federal troops. Using federal troops to buttress the effort against the protests in California. But this changes, I guess, the whole dynamic of conservatives being for more states' rights and Democrats being for more federal power. Here, the whole thing is kind of submerged and really kind of transmogrified, at least on this issue.
Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian. Again, always good to see you here at Live Now from Fox. Thank you so much for your insight. You take care.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Of course.